The coins made small clicking sounds as I separated them into careful piles on the scarred table, my fingers sorting through quarters and dimes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this too many times before. Soup or soup and bread. That was the calculation. The bread was $2 and the soup was $4, and I had $6.75, which meant I could afford both. But then I would have nothing left for tomorrow, and tomorrow was Friday, and I wouldn't get paid until next week, and Margaret needed money for textbooks. Just soup then. My stomach cramped in protest, but I pushed the feeling down into that quiet place where I kept all the other uncomfortable truths about my life now. The waitress passed my table for the third time, and I felt her eyes on me, that particular blend of pity and discomfort that made my skin burn. I kept my gaze down. I had worn my good suit today, the navy one that used to fit better before I lost weight, and I had pressed it carefully this morning and checked the seams for fraying and tried to look like someone who belonged in the world of normal people with normal problems. The cafe door opened, and the atmosphere shifted like a pressure change before a storm. I didn't look up. I was counting the coins again to be sure, my hands trembling slightly from hunger or exhaustion, or the constant low-level fear that had become my baseline. A shadow fell across my table, blocking the weak afternoon sunlight that had been illuminating my sad little piles of change. I looked up. The man standing over me was tall enough that I had to tilt my head back, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than I made in 6 months, with dark eyes that seemed to see everything, catalog everything, miss nothing. Two other men flanked him several feet back, both watching the room with the alertness of professional security. His gaze moved from my face to the coins on the table, and something flickered in his expression, too quick to name. "What are you ordering?" His voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice used to being heard and obeyed. I swept the coins toward myself reflexively, covering them with my palms. "That's not your concern." His eyes returned to mine, and I saw interest there, sharp and focused. "From now on, you eat at my table." The words made no sense. I stared at him, trying to process what he meant, whether this was some kind of joke or threat or incomprehensible charity. "I don't know you. I don't need your table. I don't need anything from you." He didn't argue. He simply turned to the waitress who had materialized at his elbow with the attentiveness of someone who recognized power. "Bring her the special, full meal, and put it on my account." Then he walked away, his associates following, and the three of them left the cafe as abruptly as they had entered. I sat frozen, fury and humiliation burning through me in alternating waves. The meal arrived 10 minutes later. Roasted chicken, vegetables, fresh bread, soup, a side salad. The smell made saliva flood my mouth and my stomach clench with desperate need. I should leave. I should walk out and leave his charity sitting on the table untouched. But I was so hungry, so tired, so worn down by the endless calculations and deprivations. I picked up the fork. I ate. I hated him, and I hated myself, but I ate every bite. When I left the cafe an hour later, stuffed and miserable and confused, I noticed the black car idling across the street, and when I started walking toward the bus stop, it pulled away from the curb and followed me at a careful distance down the block. I turned left at the corner when I should have continued straight toward the bus stop, my pace deliberately casual even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. The black car turned left behind me. I walked another block and turned right, weaving through side streets I knew from years of walking this neighborhood, because bus fare was expensive and every dollar counted. The car followed at the same measured distance, never closing the gap, never falling back, just maintaining that constant presence like a shadow I couldn't shake. Fear climbed my throat and mixed with a fury so hot it almost choked me. What had his interference done to me? What mark had he left just by speaking to me in that cafe, by buying me a meal I hadn't asked for? My apartment building came into view, a sad structure with peeling paint and bars on the ground floor windows. sitting in a neighborhood where people learned not to ask questions or make eye contact. I climbed the steps with my key already in hand and didn't look back until I was inside with the door locked behind me. My apartment was on the third floor, and I took the stairs quickly, my breathing harsh by the time I reached my door. Inside, I went straight to the window that overlooked the street and peered down through the grimy glass. The black car had stopped at the curb directly below. As I watched, one of the men from the cafe emerged, the tall one with silver at his temples, who had stood behind the man with the dark eyes. He straightened his suit jacket, looked up at my building with casual assessment, and took up a position on the sidewalk, standing guard. My confusion tangled with outrage, and underneath both feelings, a sick dread that felt horribly familiar. I remembered other men in expensive clothes coming to our old house, the house we lost. Remembered my father's desperate explanations and my mother's silent tears, and the cold certainty that we were drowning in something beyond our control. This felt the same, but also fundamentally different. Those men had wanted to take everything. This man seemed positioned to keep something out. I had a side job tonight, bookkeeping for a small restaurant that paid me under the table. Money I desperately needed because Margaret's textbooks cost more than I'd budgeted for. I grabbed my bag and left the apartment, locked the door, descended the stairs with my shoulders squared. The man looked up as I exited the building. He moved to intercept me with smooth efficiency, his expression polite but immovable. "Miss Whitmore, I'm James Carstairs. Mr. Thornhill has asked me to ensure your safety this evening." I stopped on the bottom step, eye level with him now. "I don't need your protection or his. I have work. I'm afraid I can't allow you to leave unaccompanied." His tone was apologetic, but his body language was clear. He wasn't moving. This is insane. I don't know him. I didn't ask for any of this. I have bills to pay and a job to get to, and you're in my way. Nevertheless, I have my orders. We stood there in a silent standoff, and I realized with sick helplessness that I couldn't physically move him, couldn't get past him, couldn't do anything but surrender or call the police and explain what exactly, that a well-dressed man was standing on a public sidewalk. I turned around and went back inside, back up the stairs, back into my apartment where I texted my restaurant contact that I couldn't make it tonight, watching the income I couldn't afford to lose disappear. I pulled out my ancient laptop and searched for Alexander Thornhill, finding fragments and rumors and carefully worded news articles about civic contributions and business holdings. Nothing concrete, but enough to paint a picture of power and danger and influence that operated in shadows. At midnight, someone knocked on my door and I froze in my chair, every muscle locking. James Carstairs' voice came through the wood, calm and inexorable. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Thornhill requests your presence." I opened the door because I was still dressed in my work clothes, too anxious through the long evening hours to have even considered changing. My body too wired with confusion and fear to settle into anything resembling normalcy. James Carstairs stood in the hallway looking apologetic in a way that made his firmness even more unsettling, his expensive suit unmarred by the late hour, his expression professional. "A car is waiting downstairs, Miss Whitmore. Mr. Thornhill needs to see you." "Why?" My voice came out harder than I intended, panic sharpening the edges. "What does he want at midnight?" "It's a matter of your safety. That's all I'm authorized to say. Please, it's important." My mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last, and somewhere in the spiral of fear was the terrible thought that this was about my father's old debts after all, that somehow Alexander Thornhill had bought up that poison and now owned me the way those other men had tried to own my family. I had no choice, and we both knew it. I grabbed my bag and followed him down the stairs, past the guard still stationed outside, into the back seat of the black car that had haunted me all evening. The drive took us through the city, and I watched my neighborhood give way to better areas, places I only ever saw when the bus route detoured, streets with trees and renovated buildings, and businesses that stayed open past dark without bars on the windows. We drove further into wealth I had only glimpsed in magazines, estate properties behind gates and walls, until we pulled up to a restaurant with darkened windows and a closed sign but light glowing from deep inside. James escorted me through the empty dining room, our footsteps echoing on hardwood floors, past tables set with white linens and good silverware, into a private section in the back, where Alexander Thornhill sat alone at a table set for two with food already plated and waiting. He stood when I entered, and I noticed details I had been too disoriented to catalog in the cafe. His height that made me feel small, the way his suit fit his frame like it had been made for him, because it probably had, the thin scar along his jaw that suggested violence survived, his dark eyes that seemed to see through skin and bone straight into the messy, desperate core of me. "James, give us the room." His voice was quiet, but James left immediately, the door closing with a soft click. I didn't sit. I stood just inside the doorway with my hands clenched on my bag and demanded the explanation I was owed. "Why am I here? What is this?" Alexander gestured to the chair across from him, his movements controlled and precise. "You're in danger because you were seen with me this afternoon. My enemies will have noted my interest. You need protection until I can neutralize the threat." I almost laughed from the sheer absurdity. "I didn't ask for your interest. I don't want your protection. I can't afford to be entangled with whatever you are. It's too late." His certainty was absolute, unshakable. "The moment I spoke to you in that cafe, you became a person of interest to people who would hurt you to hurt me. I won't allow that to happen." I saw the truth in his face, the iron determination, and my fear crystallized into something sharp and cold. I was trapped in something I didn't understand by a man I didn't know because he had decided to notice me. "Please sit. Eat. You're safe here." My legs were shaking, so I sat because the alternative was collapsing, and he served me himself, plating food with careful attention, the intimacy of the gesture more unsettling than anything else that had happened. His phone vibrated on the table as we sat in tense silence. He read the message and his expression darkened like a storm moving in, and when he looked up at me, there was something like regret in his eyes. "They've already moved. Your apartment building is burning. Margaret." The name ripped from my throat before I could think, before I could process anything beyond the terror that my sister sometimes stayed at my apartment when her roommate's boyfriend visited, that tonight was Tuesday, and Margaret had an early class on Wednesdays, and she might have been there, might have been inside when they set the fire. Alexander was already speaking into his phone, his voice sharp with command, and I lunged across the table trying to grab it from him, needing to call her myself, needing to hear her voice. He caught my wrists with his free hand, gentle but immovable, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that cut through my panic. "Breathe. Tell me who Margaret is." "My sister." The words came out broken and gasping. "She's 22. She has class tomorrow morning. Sometimes she stays over to save on transit. I don't know if she was there tonight. I don't know." Alexander spoke into the phone without releasing my wrists, his grip the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. "James, verify if anyone was inside the building. Check hospitals. Margaret Whitmore, 22, possible overnight guest. Send someone to the university, find her now." My legs gave out, and I collapsed back into the chair, shaking so violently my teeth chattered. Alexander ended the call and moved around the table, kneeling beside my chair in a shift of power dynamic that would have shocked me if I could feel anything beyond terror. His hand settled on my shoulder, warm and solid, his voice low and absolutely certain. "My people will find her. She'll be safe." I couldn't process his nearness, couldn't think about anything except Margaret scared and hurt, or worse. Couldn't breathe around the image of flames consuming the building that had been my home for 3 years. The minutes stretched like hours. Alexander stayed exactly where he was, kneeling beside me with his hand on my shoulder, his presence solid and grounding in a way I hated, because I shouldn't need his touch to keep from shattering. His phone rang and he answered immediately. James. Tell me. I watched his face for any flicker of bad news, my heart suspended between beats. Margaret Whitmore was not in the building. We've located her at the university library, East Wing study rooms. Security detail is en route to collect her. The sob that tore from my chest was relief and residual terror mixed together, and Alexander's hand tightened on my shoulder. She's safe. We're going to get her now and bring her somewhere secure. I nodded because I couldn't speak, and he helped me stand with surprising gentleness for a man who commanded with such absolute authority. The drive to the university passed in a blur of streetlights and Alexander's quiet explanations. Victor Ravenscroft, a rival who's been looking for leverage. You became that leverage the moment I showed interest in you. Eleanor, I need you to understand that anyone close to you is now categorized as a vulnerability he can exploit. The guilt crashed over me in waves. Margaret was in danger because of me, because some crime lord had bought me lunch and I'd been too hungry to refuse it. This is my fault, I whispered. Alexander's response was immediate and firm. This is my fault. I made the choice to approach you. I knew the risks. I'll fix this. We pulled up to the library, and I saw Margaret emerging between two men in dark suits, her face pale with fear and confusion, her backpack clutched to her chest like a shield. I was out of the car before it fully stopped, running to her, my hands reaching for her face and shoulders to verify she was real and whole and unharmed. Ellie, what's happening? Why are these men? What's going on? I couldn't answer because I didn't have answers that would make sense, could only hold her and feel her trembling against me. Alexander approached with measured steps, his attention moving between us and the surrounding darkness with the focus of someone expecting threats. We need to move. Now. Margaret's terrified eyes found him, and I saw her recognize the danger in him, the power. Who is that? I'll explain everything, I promised, knowing I had no idea how to explain any of this. Alexander gestured toward the cars, and we started moving as a group, his men forming a protective circle. We were 10 feet from the vehicles when the first shot cracked through the night, and Alexander slammed into both of us, his body driving us down behind the nearest car as the world exploded into gunfire and chaos. The world became nothing but noise and terror, the sharp crack of gunfire splitting the night air, while Alexander's weight pressed me and Margaret down against the cold pavement behind the car. Margaret was screaming, her voice raw and animal, and I could feel her body jerking with hysterical sobs beneath me as I tried to cover her with my own frame even though Alexander covered us both. His breathing was harsh near my ear, his chest against my back, his arms bracketing us as more shots rang out, and his men returned fire with methodical precision that suggested this was not the first time they had protected their employer under assault. The smell of gunpowder burned my nostrils, acrid and chemical, mixing with the strange awareness of Alexander's cologne, something dark and expensive that my brain registered even through the absolute chaos, and I hated myself for noticing anything except survival. The gunfire stopped as abruptly as it started, the silence somehow worse than the noise, ringing in my ears like the aftermath of an explosion. Alexander did not move immediately, his body still sheltering ours, tension coiled in every muscle as he waited for confirmation that the threat had passed. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low and controlled near my ear, steady despite the violence. I could not speak, could only shake my head in a jerky motion that might have been a nod or a denial, my throat closed with fear. Margaret. Check Margaret. The words came out broken, and I forced myself to twist beneath his weight, reaching for my sister's face, finding her eyes wild and unseeing with terror, but her body intact, no blood, no wounds. "She's okay," I managed, and Alexander lifted off us with surprising gentleness, rising to a crouch and pulling us both up with strong hands that steadied me when my legs threatened to give out. Across the street I saw them, Two bodies sprawled on the pavement in the unnatural poses of death, dark pools spreading beneath them, and my stomach heaved. I turned away, gagging, and Alexander moved instantly to block my view, his hand on my chin directing my face toward his instead. "Look at me, Eleanor. We need to move now." I focused on his eyes, dark and intense, using them as an anchor, while he guided both Margaret and me toward the armored SUV, his men forming a protective circle as we moved. Margaret was crying in loud, gasping sobs, demanding answers that neither of us could give, and I held her against me as Alexander slid into the seat beside us, and the vehicle began moving before the door fully closed. "What did you do?" Margaret turned on me with terrified fury, her face blotchy and wet. "What did you do to make this happen?" "I'm sorry." The words were ash in my mouth, inadequate and hollow. "I'm so sorry." "Your sister did nothing wrong." Alexander's voice cut through Margaret's rising hysteria with absolute authority. I made a choice that had consequences. I approached Eleanor. I involved her in my world. "I'm responsible for this situation, and I will resolve it." Margaret stared at him with something between terror and desperate hope, and I watched the city roll past the tinted windows as we drove through residential neighborhoods into areas of wealth that existed in a different reality from mine. We passed through massive iron gates that closed behind us with electronic precision, up a curved driveway to a mansion that looked like something from a movie, all clean modern lines and walls of glass lit from within. Alexander ushered us inside with a hand on my lower back, a touch that burned through my shirt, past guards stationed at intervals through hallways lined with art I could probably never afford to see in museums. He led us to a wing of private rooms, opening doors to reveal connected bedrooms decorated in soft neutrals with a shared bathroom between them. Everything we might need apparently anticipated and prepared. Margaret clutched at my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "You'll stay here under full security until the situation is resolved," Alexander addressed us both, but his eyes kept returning to me. "Days at minimum, possibly weeks." My life was gone, shattered into pieces I could not imagine reassembling, and I stood in a stranger's mansion wearing yesterday's clothes, with my sister's terrified breathing loud in my ears. "We'll talk in the morning," Alexander said to me specifically, his attention heavy and weighted with things beyond duty or obligation. "You need rest." But his eyes told a different story, something personal and intense that made my breath catch despite everything. He turned to leave and I found my voice before he reached the door. The question that had been burning since the cafe. "Why did you approach me at all? What made you notice me?" He paused with his hand on the doorframe, looked back over his shoulder, and for just a moment, the mask of control slipped, and I saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression before he answered. "You looked like someone trying to stay invisible but failing completely." The words hung in the air after he left, the door closing with a quiet click that somehow felt louder than the gunfire from hours before. And I stood frozen in the center of the room trying to parse what he meant, what any of this meant. "Eleanor." Margaret's voice was sharp and frightened behind me, her hand gripping my arm hard enough to hurt. "What is happening? Who is that man? Why are we here?" I turned to face my sister and saw the terror in her eyes, the accusation already forming, and I had no defense to offer. "I met him 2 days ago in a cafe." The explanation sounded absurd even as I spoke it. "He bought me lunch. He said I would eat at his table from now on." I thought he was just some wealthy man being presumptuous. I didn't know who he was or what it would mean. Margaret's face went white, then red. "You got us tangled with a criminal because he bought you lunch." The words were knives, and I couldn't deflect them because she was right. I had accepted his meal when I should have walked away hungry, had eaten every bite while knowing something was wrong. "We need to call the police." Margaret pulled out her phone with shaking hands. "We need to tell them we're being held here, that people shot at us, that our apartment was burned." I caught her wrist before she could dial. The police can't help us, I said quietly. These people operate beyond whatever protection the law can offer. If we run, if we try to use normal channels, we'll be dead before anyone can respond. You don't know that, Margaret's voice broke. You're scared and you're not thinking clearly. We can't just stay here as prisoners. The argument that followed was fierce and whispered, both of us aware of the guards somewhere in the hallways beyond our doors. Both of us exhausted and terrified, and turning on each other because there was no one else to blame. Margaret cried, and I held her and apologized over and over for dragging her into this, and eventually we collapsed into one of the beds together like we used to as children when thunderstorms scared us, seeking comfort in proximity, even when comfort felt impossible to find. I woke before dawn disoriented by softness, by silk sheets against my skin, and a mattress that didn't sag or creak, the luxury jarring against every reality I had known for the past 3 years since my father died and left us with nothing but debts and shame. Margaret slept beside me with tear tracks dried on her face, and I slipped out carefully, exploring the room in the gray pre-dawn light. The closet held clothes in my size, jeans and sweaters, and soft cashmere that felt like touching clouds, and the bathroom was stocked with toiletries and cosmetics I recognized from store displays I had never been able to afford. Someone had guessed my sizes, anticipated my needs, known me well enough to select these specific things, and the intimacy of that attention made my skin prickle with unease, and something else I did not want to examine. I showered in water that stayed hot, dressed in clothes that fit perfectly, left Margaret sleeping, and ventured into the hallway following the smell of coffee, through a house that was silent but watchful. Guards I sensed but did not see. The kitchen was massive and modern, all clean lines and marble surfaces, and Alexander stood at the counter in dark slacks and a gray button-down with his tablet in hand, looking more human than he had in his suits, more accessible. He glanced up when I entered, unsurprised, as if he had expected me at exactly this moment. "Coffee," he offered, already reaching for a second cup. I accepted because my hands needed something to hold, and we stood in the morning light that poured through the windows, the domestic intimacy of the scene strange and unsettling against the violence of the previous night. "How long have you been watching me?" The question came out steady, despite the fear underneath it. 3 weeks, Alexander answered without hesitation. "Since you started eating lunch at that cafe. I noticed you the first day. I couldn't stop noticing you after that." A chill ran through me. "You've been stalking me." He did not deny it, did not soften it. "I was trying to understand why you affected me before I acted on the impulse. Eleanor, your life was precarious. You were one emergency away from complete catastrophe. Now at least you're safe and fed." I hated that he was right, hated him for seeing my vulnerability so clearly, hated myself for being so transparent. James entered before I could respond, his expression urgent as he moved close to Alexander and whispered something I could not hear. Alexander's face hardened into something cold and dangerous, and when he looked at me again, his eyes held regret and fury combined. "Victor Ravenscroft has made contact. He's demanding a meeting. The price for leaving you and Margaret alone is you. Delivered to him as compensation for my disrespect in protecting someone he considers beneath notice." Terror flooded through me, cold and absolute as the meaning of Victor's demand settled into my bones, and I opened my mouth to speak, but Alexander's voice cut through the air before I could form words, his refusal flat and absolute and utterly certain in a way that left no room for negotiation or debate. James shifted his weight, uncomfortable, and explained in careful terms that Victor Ravenscroft was framing this as a matter of respect, claiming that Alexander had shown weakness by protecting someone Victor considered beneath notice, a nobody from the margins of society who should mean nothing to a man of Alexander's position, and by making her significant through his protection, Alexander had issued an insult that demanded compensation. Victor wanted to take me to prove that Alexander was vulnerable, that his interest could be exploited, that caring about anything outside his empire made him weak. I watched Alexander's expression shudder into something cold and lethal, fury contained behind a mask of control, but visible in the tension of his jaw and the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. And for the first time, I saw the violence that lived beneath his careful courtesy, the ruthlessness that had built his empire and held it against rivals who wanted to tear it down. I should have been terrified of him in that moment, but instead I felt a strange fascination, an awareness that he was dangerous, but the danger was not pointed at me, that his fury was on my behalf, even though I was a stranger who had stumbled into his world by accident. He told James to arrange a meeting with Victor on his terms, neutral territory, his people providing security, and James nodded and left without argument, leaving us alone in the kitchen with morning sunlight streaming through windows that suddenly felt less like openings to the world and more like vulnerabilities someone could shoot through. The silence stretched between us, and I forced myself to ask what would happen now, my voice steadier than I felt. Alexander turned to me, and I saw him reimpose control over himself, the mask sliding back into place as he explained in measured tones that there would be a negotiation, a show of force, a reminder of why people did not challenge him without severe consequences. "Will you go to war over me?" I asked. "Over a stranger who means nothing?" He stepped closer, into my space, and I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact, as his intensity focused entirely on me like a spotlight that burned. "You are not a stranger anymore, Eleanor. You are under my protection. That means something in my world. Victor knows it. This is not really about you, it is about power and respect, and testing boundaries to see if I have grown soft." But his eyes told a different story, something personal and possessive that had nothing to do with power politics and everything to do with the way he looked at me like I was something precious he had found and refused to relinquish. I could not look away from him, could not breathe properly with him so close, and the tension between us shifted into something electric and dangerous in an entirely different way. His hand lifted toward my face as if to touch my cheek, and I found myself leaning into the motion before he stopped himself and stepped back, the loss of his nearness somehow worse than the intensity of it had been. "Eat breakfast," he said, his voice rough. "Keep Margaret calm. Stay inside where my people can protect you." Then he left before I could respond, and I stood alone in the kitchen with my heart racing and my hands shaking, unsure whether I was more frightened of Victor Ravenscroft, who wanted to take me, or of Alexander Thornhill, who made me feel things I had no business feeling. Margaret appeared in the doorway looking hostile and scared in equal measure, demanding to know what was happening, what the urgent conversation had been about, and I explained Victor's demand in halting words that sounded insane even as I spoke them. Margaret's response was immediate hysteria, insisting we should run, escape, disappear before these men destroyed us both, and I felt exhaustion settle over me like a weight as I explained what I had already come to understand. We could not run, because Victor's people would find us. We had no resources and no protection and nowhere to go that his reach would not extend. We were safer here behind Alexander's walls and guards than we would be anywhere else in the world. "You are being seduced by his wealth and power," Margaret accused, her voice sharp and cutting. "You are forgetting that he is a criminal, that everything he has was built on violence and exploitation, that we should not be here." The words stung because there was truth in them, a grain of accuracy that I could not deny even as I rejected the larger implication. When Margaret moved toward the door with wild determination to leave, I had to physically intercept her, grabbing her arms and holding her back as she struggled against me, both of us fighting in fierce whispers because we were aware of guards nearby who would intervene if we became too loud. She finally collapsed against me sobbing, and I held her and promised I would fix this somehow, even though I had no idea how to make that promise real. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Alexander gone to handle whatever business required his attention, guards visible at every corridor intersection. Margaret and I trapped in luxurious captivity with nothing to do but wait and worry. Evening came with shadows stretching across the grounds visible through the windows, and Alexander returned looking exhausted in a way that made him seem more human and less untouchable. I had retreated to the library, drawn by the presence of books, needing the comfort of familiar things, even if the volumes on these shelves cost more than I made in a year, and he found me there and sat in the chair across from mine without speaking. "How does the situation stand?" I asked into the quiet. "Tomorrow night," he answered. "Neutral territory, a warehouse complex that neither of us controls. Victor will posture and make threats to establish his position. I will remind him of the cost of actual conflict." "What happens if he does not back down?" I whispered. Alexander met my eyes and held them and said, "Then people die. And I need to know if you can live with that, with being the reason for bloodshed." The moral crisis laid bare between us in the quiet library, and I could not reconcile the weight of lives against my own survival, could not accept that people might die because a powerful man had noticed me counting coins in a cafe. "I do not want anyone dying because of me." The words came out raw and honest. Alexander watched me with those dark eyes that missed nothing, and explained in a tone that held no judgment that his world did not operate on innocence and guilt the way mine did, that violence was currency and respect was survival, that Victor would keep pushing until Alexander pushed back harder because anything less would be seen as weakness that others would exploit. "But there has to be another way," I insisted, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I could disappear, leave the city, remove myself as the catalyst so you would have no reason to fight." His response was immediate and sharp, cutting through my desperate logic. "You would be dead within a week, Eleanor. Victor's interest is locked on you now. He sees you as my vulnerability whether you stay or go. Only my protection keeps you breathing." The trap closed tighter around me, and I felt the walls of my choices narrowing to a single path I had not chosen and did not want. "What do you get from this?" I demanded, anger breaking through fear. "Why spend resources and risk war for someone you do not even know? What possible benefit makes this worth it to you?" The silence stretched long enough that I thought he might not answer, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of the authority he usually carried. "I am tired of everything in my life being transactional," he said, looking not at me but at his hands. "When I saw you in that cafe counting those coins with such concentration and dignity, trying to calculate if you could afford to eat, something shifted in me. You reminded me that people still exist who fight for normal things, small things. A bowl of soup and a piece of bread, who have not been swallowed by the world I inhabit. I wanted to protect that. Protect you." The loneliness in his words struck me harder than his earlier intensity, and I saw past the power and danger to the isolation beneath, the man who commanded an empire but lived alone inside it. "Do you regret it now?" I asked softly, "now that it has gotten so complicated?" "No." The answer came without hesitation, his eyes finding mine again with renewed intensity. "I regret the danger I brought to you, but I do not regret meeting you, knowing you, having you here where I can keep you safe." The air between us charged with something electric and terrifying, and I should have been thinking about survival and escape. But instead, I was noticing how the lamplight caught gold in his dark eyes, how exhaustion made his face more human and accessible, how his presence filled the space between us until I could barely breathe. "What happens after tomorrow?" I whispered. "If you win, if Victor backs down." "You stay under my protection until all threats are neutralized," he answered. "Then you choose whether to return to your old life or accept what I am offering you." The question formed before I could stop it. "What are you offering?" Alexander stood and crossed the distance to my chair, looking down at me with an expression of naked want that made my pulse race and my breath catch. And his voice was rough and honest when he said, "Security, safety, everything you need for yourself and Margaret. And if you want it, me, all of me, not as a transaction, but as a choice you make freely." I should have refused, should have been appalled by the presumption, but my treacherous body leaned toward him, and my mind catalogued the way his hands curled at his sides as if restraining himself from reaching for me. And I realized with shocking clarity that I was drawn to him not despite the danger, but woven through it. That somewhere between his declaration in the cafe and this moment, I had begun to see him as more than a threat, had begun to want what he offered, even knowing the cost. Before I could respond to his declaration, the library door opened, and James appeared looking urgent and grim, his interruption shattering the charged moment between us like glass breaking, and Alexander straightened immediately, all vulnerability vanishing behind the mask of control he wore so expertly. "Victor has moved up the timeline," James said without preamble. "He wants the meeting tonight in 2 hours, or he will take action against additional targets. He has named Margaret specifically, and your friend Sophia Redmond." The cold that flooded through me at hearing Sophia's name was absolute and paralyzing, because I had not considered that anyone beyond Margaret might be pulled into this nightmare, had not thought about my best friend, who knew nothing of Alexander or Victor or the danger I had stumbled into. Alexander was already moving toward the door, issuing commands to James about security protocols and vehicle arrangements, his mind clearly racing through tactical considerations, and I forced myself to stand on legs that shook and follow them into the hallway. "You cannot go tonight," I said, my voice coming out stronger than I felt. "It is too fast. He is trying to throw you off balance. Make you react instead of plan." Alexander stopped and turned to look at me with something like surprise and appreciation in his expression. "You are right," he said. "That is exactly what Victor is attempting. But if I refuse, he will hurt people to prove he can. That is how this works. I cannot show hesitation." "Then take me with you." The words came out before I could evaluate their wisdom. "If this is about me, then let me be there. Let Victor see that I am not some helpless prize to be traded, but a person who chooses to stand with you." The silence that followed my declaration stretched thin and dangerous. James looked shocked, and Alexander's expression cycled through refusal and consideration, and something darker that might have been pride or possession. "Absolutely not," Alexander finally said. "You will stay here where you are protected. I will not bring you into a room with Victor Ravenscroft where anything could happen." I stepped closer to him, invading his space the way he had invaded mine in the library, and looked up to meet his eyes with all the determination I could gather. "If I stay here, I am a thing to be discussed and negotiated over. If I come, I am a person making a choice. That changes the dynamic entirely, and you know it." Alexander stared down at me, and I watched him war with himself, his protective instincts battling against the strategic truth of what I was saying. James cleared his throat and spoke carefully. "She is not wrong. If Eleanor appears at the meeting voluntarily by your side, it undermines Victor's entire position that you have taken something from him or shown weakness. It demonstrates strength and partnership, rather than possession." I could see the moment Alexander made his decision in the tightening of his jaw and the way his hands flexed at his sides. "If you come," he said slowly, "you follow every instruction I give without question or hesitation. You stay within arm's reach of me at all times, and if I tell you to run, you run and do not look back. Do you understand?" I nodded because I understood I had just committed myself to something terrifying and irreversible, had chosen to walk into danger rather than hide from it, and the look Alexander gave me was complex and intense, and made my heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. The preparation for the meeting consumed the next hours with a speed that left me breathless and disoriented as Alexander transformed before my eyes from the tired man in the library to something harder and more dangerous. His staff moving through the house with military precision, weapons appearing from hidden places, communications equipment spread across his office in a dizzying array of technology and planning. I was given instructions by a woman named Maria, who appeared with armor concealed as elegant clothing, a vest thin enough to wear under the silk blouse she handed me, but strong enough to stop a bullet, she assured me in accented English, and the reality of what I had volunteered for crystallized into sharp focus that made my hands shake as I dressed. Margaret refused to speak to me after I told her I was going to the meeting, her silence more damning than her earlier accusations, and I left her in the secured bedroom with guards outside, feeling the weight of her fear and anger like stones in my chest. Alexander found me standing in the hallway outside his office, unable to make myself enter, and something in his expression softened when he saw my face, and he drew me inside away from the organized chaos and closed the door to create a pocket of quiet. "You can still change your mind," he said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only concern, and something that looked like hope that I would choose safety. "I cannot hide while other people face consequences for his interest in me," I answered, and my voice only shook a little. Alexander studied my face as if memorizing it, and stepped close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact, and his hand lifted to cup my jaw with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone so dangerous. "You are braver than you know," he said quietly, and the words settled into my chest alongside the fear and tangled with the growing feelings I could no longer deny. "When we leave that meeting, you will have a choice to make, Eleanor, whether you want to return to your old life or stay in mine, and I need you to know that whatever you choose, I will respect it and ensure you and Margaret are protected either way." The offer was freedom wrapped in safety, and it terrified me more than Victor's threats because it required me to acknowledge what I wanted rather than simply react to danger. "I do not know what I want," I whispered, and it was the most honest thing I had said in days. Alexander's thumb brushed across my cheekbone, and his eyes held mine with an intensity that made breathing difficult. "Yes, you do," he said. "You are just afraid to admit it, and that is all right. Fear is not weakness." His mouth was close enough that I could feel his breath, and every instinct screamed at me to close the distance, but James knocked and entered before I could act on the impulse, and the moment shattered as Alexander stepped back and became the crime lord again, all business and controlled violence. "It is time," James said simply, and Alexander nodded and offered me his arm like we were going to a dinner party rather than a meeting that could end in bloodshed. And I took it because turning back was no longer possible, and perhaps had never been. The motorcade that left Alexander's estate consisted of 4 vehicles moving through the city with military precision, and I sat beside him in the center car, watching streetlights blur past while my heart hammered against the thin armor concealed beneath my borrowed clothes, the weight of it a constant reminder that people expected bullets tonight. Alexander had been silent since we departed, his hand resting on his thigh close enough to mine that I could feel the heat of him, but not touching, and I wondered if the distance was deliberate, or if he was simply lost in whatever calculations a man made before walking into potential violence. James sat in the front beside the driver, speaking quietly into a radio, coordinating with the other vehicles and with people I could not see, and the professional competence on display should have been reassuring, but instead made everything feel more real and more dangerous. "We are 10 minutes out," James said without turning around, and Alexander acknowledged with a slight nod before finally looking at me with an expression I could not fully read. "When we arrive, you stay at my left side," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Do not speak unless Victor addresses you directly. Do not react to anything he says, no matter how personal or cruel. He will try to provoke a response because emotional reactions are weaknesses he can exploit." I nodded because my throat was too tight for words. "If shooting starts," Alexander continued, "James will cover you and get you to the car. Do not wait for me. Do not look back. I need to know you will leave if ordered." The idea of running while he stayed to face bullets made something twist painfully in my chest, but I nodded again because I had agreed to follow his instructions and because arguing now would only distract him. He studied my face as if checking for cracks in my resolve, and then did what he had stopped himself from doing earlier. Reached up and cupped my jaw with his palm warm and calloused against my skin. "You are braver than anyone I have ever brought into this world," he said quietly, "and I do not take that for granted." The words settled into me alongside the fear and transformed into something that felt dangerously like courage, or maybe just recklessness, born from knowing that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same, regardless of outcome. The car slowed and turned into what looked like an industrial area, warehouses looming dark against the night sky, and my stomach dropped as I realized we had arrived at the neutral territory where Alexander would face the man who wanted to destroy him and take me as proof of that destruction. The vehicle stopped in formation and James spoke quickly into his radio before turning to look at Alexander with grim readiness. "Victor is already inside with 8 men. We have 12 positioned around the perimeter. Odds are acceptable." Alexander's hand dropped from my face, and he became something else entirely, all warmth, vanishing behind a mask of cold authority that made him look capable of terrible things. "Stay close," he said to me, and then he opened the door and stepped out into the night, and I followed because turning back had stopped being possible the moment I counted coins in a cafe and caught the attention of a man who ruled the darkness. The warehouse was vast and cold, our footsteps echoing against concrete as Alexander led me inside with James and 4 armed men flanking us in tight formation. And the space opened into what looked like it had once been a loading area, but now stood empty except for a table in the center, with chairs on either side, like some grotesque parody of a business meeting. Victor Ravenscroft waited at the far end with his men arrayed behind him, and even from a distance I could see he was different from Alexander in every way that mattered, where Alexander was controlled and precise. Victor radiated a kind of manic energy that set my nerves screaming, his smile too wide and his movements too loose as he watched us approach. Alexander's hand pressed briefly against my lower back, a touch of reassurance or possibly possession, before he guided me to stand slightly behind his left shoulder as instructed, and I forced myself to breathe slowly and keep my expression neutral, even as my heart tried to beat its way out of my chest. Victor's gaze found me immediately and crawled over my face and body with an assessment that made my skin want to peel away, and his smile sharpened into something predatory as he ignored Alexander entirely to address me directly in a voice that sounded like gravel wrapped in silk. "So you are the woman who made the great Alexander Thornhill forget himself," he said, "and I must admit, I do not see what justifies burning buildings and risking war. You look rather ordinary to me." The insult was designed to provoke, and I felt Alexander go absolutely still beside me, a dangerous quality entering the air around him, but I remembered his instructions and kept my mouth closed and my gaze level even as humiliation burned through me. Alexander's voice when he spoke was cold enough to frost the air between us. "You requested this meeting to discuss territorial boundaries and the consequences of targeting civilians under my protection," he said, making it clear the subject of my appearance was closed. Victor finally shifted his attention to Alexander, and the amusement dropped from his face to reveal something harder and more calculating beneath. "I requested this meeting to discuss your weakness," Victor corrected, "because a man who goes to war over a poverty case from the wrong side of the city is a man who has lost perspective, and lost perspective leads to lost territory." The words were designed to diminish both Alexander's judgment and my worth simultaneously, reducing our entire situation to a strategic error, and I felt the weight of the accusations settle across my shoulders alongside the guilt I had been carrying since the shooting. Alexander did not rise to the bait, simply stated in that same cold, controlled voice that Victor had burned an apartment building with 16 families inside and killed 2 people in a public shooting, actions that violated every agreement about civilian collateral, and those violations required consequences regardless of the initial target. Victor leaned back in his chair with that too wide smile returning, and said the only consequence he recognized was strength, and Alexander had shown him weakness, had revealed a vulnerability that could be exploited. And in their world, weakness was permission. "I am giving you an opportunity to correct your error," Victor continued, his eyes sliding back to me with hunger that made my stomach turn. Give me the girl for 24 hours, as recompense for the disrespect you have shown by elevating her above her station, and I will consider your debt paid and boundaries restored. The casual way he discussed borrowing me like an object, the specific mention of 24 hours that promised horrors I could not let myself imagine, hit me like a physical blow, and I must have made some sound or movement because Alexander's hand shot back to grip my wrist in warning or reassurance. There is no universe in which that occurs, Alexander said, and his voice carried a finality that allowed no negotiation. Eleanor Whitmore is under my protection permanently. She is not currency and not available for any transaction, and your confusion on this point tells me you have fundamentally misunderstood the situation. Victor's expression shifted from amusement to something colder and more calculating as he processed Alexander's declaration, and the air in the warehouse thickened with tension that felt like it might ignite at any moment, both sets of men behind their respective leaders going rigid with anticipation of violence. You misunderstand your position, Victor said with deliberate slowness, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward in his chair. You have built your empire on reputation and fear, but both require perception of invincibility, and you have shown me a crack in your armor by elevating this woman above strategic sense. I am simply exploiting the weakness you displayed. Alexander remained utterly still in that way that made him seem more dangerous rather than less, and when he spoke his voice carried a weight that made even Victor's men shift uncomfortably. The only misunderstanding here is yours, Alexander said quietly. You have mistaken protection for weakness and investment for vulnerability. You see a woman I have chosen to shelter, and assume sentiment has made me soft. But what you should see is a man who has sufficient power and resources that he can prioritize what he values without compromise. I felt something twist in my chest at being described as something he valued, the words settling into the confused tangle of fear and attraction that had been growing since the moment his shadow fell across my coins in that cafe, and I hated that even here in mortal danger part of my mind was cataloging the way he spoke about me with possession and certainty. Victor's smile returned, but it looked sharp enough to cut. Pretty words, he said, but they do not change the mathematics of our situation. You are spread thin protecting her and the sister and whatever other loose ends this infatuation has created, while I am concentrated and focused and willing to do what you apparently are not. Alexander tilted his head slightly in a gesture that might have been curiosity or might have been a predator calculating an attack. And what is it you believe I am unwilling to do? He asked with genuine interest, threading through the menace. Victor gestured broadly at the space between them. Sacrifice her, Victor said bluntly. The smart play is to cut your losses and hand over the girl. Take the reputation hit now and rebuild. But you are sitting here pretending this is negotiable, which tells me she has gotten under your skin in a way that makes you compromised. The casual dismissal of my humanity, the reduction of my entire existence to a chess piece to be sacrificed or traded, should have made me feel small and powerless, but instead I felt anger beginning to burn through the fear, hot and bright and clarifying. Alexander's hand moved slightly, a minute gesture, but every one of his men responded by shifting their stance in a way that made Victor's guards tense, and I realized I was watching a language of violence being spoken in increments too small for civilian understanding. I am not compromised, Alexander said with finality. I am simply drawing a line you apparently need illustrated. Eleanor Whitmore is not available for negotiation or trade or temporary loan. She is permanently under my protection, which means harming her or leveraging her is functionally identical to attacking me directly, and we both know what happens to people who attack me directly. The threat hung in the cold air between them, crystallized and absolute, and Victor's expression finally showed something other than amusement, a flash of genuine calculation as he reassessed whatever assumptions he had brought to this meeting. Victor's expression cycled through calculation and frustration before settling into something harder and more resolved, as he leaned back in his chair with deliberate casualness that fooled no one in the warehouse. "You are making a mistake," he said finally, his tone shifting from negotiation to something that sounded like warning wrapped in false concern. "But I suppose every man is entitled to his errors in judgment. Just know that I will be waiting for the inevitable moment when your sentimentality costs you more than you can afford." Alexander's posture never changed, but something in the quality of his stillness shifted, and I felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees as he regarded Victor with the kind of patience predators show prey they have already decided to kill. "The moment you set fire to that building, you crossed a line that removed the option of waiting," Alexander said with terrifying quiet. "And the moment you demanded Eleanor's payment, you confirmed you do not understand the rules you are playing by. So let me clarify them in terms simple enough that even your arrogance cannot misinterpret." He stood slowly, and his men moved with him in perfect synchronization, a display of unified force that made Victor's guards tense and reach for weapons they had not yet drawn. "Eleanor Whitmore is mine," Alexander continued, with each word falling like a stone into still water. "She is not currency, and not leverage, and not available for any transaction or negotiation or temporary arrangement. She is protected by everything I have built, and everyone who answers to me. And any further action against her or her sister will be met with the complete dismantling of your organization and everyone in it." The possessive declaration sent heat flooding through my chest, even as my rational mind screamed that I should be horrified by being claimed like property. But there was something in the absolute certainty of his protection that made me feel safer than I had since my father died and left us drowning in his debts. Victor stood as well, and his smile had entirely vanished, leaving behind something cold and calculating. "Then we are at an impasse," he said, "because I cannot let this challenge go unanswered without looking weak to everyone watching, and you apparently cannot be reasoned into strategic sense, which leaves only one resolution." Alexander nodded slowly as if Victor had finally said something intelligent. "Then we are clear," he agreed, and his hand moved in that minute gesture again, his men responding by creating a tighter formation around us. I felt James move closer to my right side, positioned to shield me, and the awareness that violence was about to erupt made my heart slam against my ribs hard enough to hurt. Victor's eyes moved to me one final time with naked hunger and calculation. "Such a waste," he said almost sadly. "She will not even survive what is coming. Collateral damage in a war her existence started. I hope she was worth it." The words hit me like a physical blow, the confirmation that my presence had indeed started something that would end in blood and death. But before I could process the guilt, Alexander spoke again, and his voice carried a finality that allowed no response. "She is worth everything," he said, "and you will never get close enough to test that theory. This meeting is over. Leave now while that is still an option." Victor's men moved first, which was their fatal mistake, reaching for weapons with the kind of telegraphed aggression that marked them as less disciplined than Alexander's organization, and in the space between one breath and the next, the warehouse erupted into motion as Alexander's guards responded with brutal efficiency that came from years of working as a unified force. I felt James's hand on my arm, pulling me backward and down behind the relative shelter of a support column, my body moving on his command before my mind could process what was happening, and the sound of gunfire exploded through the space, loud enough to make my ears ring and my heart seize with pure animal terror. Alexander had moved the moment his men did, drawing a weapon I hadn't realized he was carrying with the kind of fluid grace that spoke of long familiarity with violence. And even through my fear, I couldn't stop watching him as he fired twice with calm precision that dropped one of Victor's guards before the man had fully cleared his holster. Victor had thrown himself behind his chair, his face twisted with fury, and what might have been fear, shouting orders that were lost beneath the cacophony of bullets striking metal and concrete, and I realized with sick clarity that this confrontation had always been destined to end in blood. That negotiation had only ever been a pretense for both men to position their pieces before the inevitable violence. The exchange lasted maybe 30 seconds, but felt like hours, my perception stretching each moment into excruciating detail as I watched Alexander move through the chaos with terrifying competence, his body positioned to keep himself between the shooters and the column where James had me sheltered. 3 of Victor's men went down in the initial exchange, Alexander's guards moving with coordinated precision that spoke of extensive training. And then suddenly it was over, the gunfire cutting off as abruptly as it had started, leaving behind only the ringing silence and the smell of cordite thick in the cold air. Victor was on his feet again, his weapon drawn now, but pointed at the ground in a gesture of stalemate. 2 of his remaining guards flanking him with their weapons trained on Alexander's men in a tableau of mutual destruction should anyone fire again. Alexander stood utterly still about 15 feet from Victor, his weapon held with casual competence, his breathing not even elevated despite the violence, and when he spoke his voice carried perfect clarity in the ringing aftermath. "This is your only warning," he said with the kind of calm that was somehow more frightening than rage would have been. "Walk away now and accept that Eleanor Whitmore is permanently off limits. Or continue this, and I will dismantle everything you have built piece by piece until there is nothing left but memory and cautionary tale." Victor's face was flushed with humiliation and fury, his eyes darting to his fallen men and then back to Alexander with visible calculation about odds and consequences. "You have made an enemy today," Victor said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This is not finished." Alexander's smile was cold and absolute. "Yes, it is," he said, and then he made a gesture to his men and began walking toward where James had me sheltered, holstering his weapon with the same fluid ease he had drawn it, turning his back on Victor with deliberate dismissal that made the insult unmistakable. Victor's remaining men began backing toward their vehicles with weapons still drawn and eyes fixed on Alexander's guards in a tense choreography of mutual withdrawal, and I watched from behind the column as the rival boss himself turned to leave, with his face twisted into a mask of humiliation and rage that promised future retaliation, despite the clear defeat he had just suffered. Alexander reached my position, and his hand came to rest on my shoulder, with a touch that was both possessive and reassuring, his eyes scanning my face with an intensity that made my breath catch despite the violence still hanging in the air around us like smoke. "Are you hurt?" he asked, for the second time today. His voice low and controlled, but with an undercurrent of something raw that I was beginning to recognize as genuine concern for my safety. I shook my head, because words felt impossible with my heart still slamming against my ribs and my hands shaking from adrenaline and terror. And I hated how small I felt in this moment, how completely out of my depth in a world where men shot at each other over questions of respect and possession. James appeared at Alexander's other side with his weapon still drawn and his attention fixed on the warehouse entrance, where Victor's vehicles were pulling away, with engines roaring in what sounded like automotive fury. "They will regroup and come back harder," James said quietly, and his matter-of-fact tone suggested this was a predictable outcome rather than a worst-case scenario. Alexander nodded slowly as if he had expected nothing less. "Increase security on the house, put additional teams on Margaret's detail, and I want surveillance on every property Victor owns," he ordered with the kind of calm that came from years of managing violence as a business operation. His hand moved from my shoulder to the small of my back, guiding me toward the vehicles with a touch that sent warmth spreading through my body, despite the cold fear still gripping my chest. "We need to leave now," he said, and I could hear the urgency beneath his control, the awareness that staying in this exposed location invited further confrontation. The walk to the SUV felt surreal, my feet moving automatically while my mind struggled to process what I had just witnessed, the casual brutality of the exchange. The bodies of Victor's guards still visible in my peripheral vision like grim reminders of how high the stakes had become. Alexander handed me into the vehicle with surprising gentleness, his touch lingering a moment longer than necessary, and then he was sliding in beside me with James taking the front passenger seat and the vehicle already moving before doors fully closed. The silence stretched thick and oppressive as we pulled away from the warehouse district, the driver taking turns with obvious tactical consideration, while James maintained constant communication through an earpiece with other teams I could not see. I stared at my hands in my lap and noticed they were still trembling, and I felt the weight of Alexander's attention on me like a physical pressure, even though he was not speaking. The enormity of what had just happened began settling into my bones.